Could I ask everyone to please take a seat? Could I ask everyone to please find a seat? Thank you. All right. Have you met Tim? Tim's actually going to introduce you. Right. Mr. Gillespie. Could I ask everyone to please take a seat? Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Library Hour. Tonight we have a wonderful program on a topic that is related to this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, and I'm looking forward to it. The Union League Legacy Foundation is, as you all know, the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. I'm not going to go through my normal shtick about what we do. You've all heard it a lot, except to say that this past week we had Good Citizen Day. And Good Citizen Day is a day that is all about what we believe in, which is good citizenship, and the Constitution, and being an engaged and educated citizen. And we had about 240 high school juniors here. We have a couple of our facilitators who are with us all day. I saw Ted Baker. I think Stephen, Colleen, Chris are here. And it's a wonderful day that I think all Union League members should be proud of. That and all the programs that we do, about 50 a year, are all about the values and the history and the spirit of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia. All that we do is made possible through your voluntary contributions. And I thank you for your support. And I look forward to more of it because there's much more that we need to do. So tonight's program will run about an hour long. We will have a Q&A. We are streaming live, so you're going to need to use the microphones. And as always, a question should be no more than 2, maybe 3 sentences. And if you can't put a question mark on the end of that sentence, you have failed. So please stay with us here. We can cut you off on Zoom. Just stay with us with regard to that. A few housekeeping items too. If you would please turn off or at least silence your cell phones, we'd appreciate that. Couple of upcoming programs. April 26th, we have a special grant program with Ron White. April 27th is General Grant's 200th birthday. If you haven't signed up for it, you might be shut out. I would sign up for it tonight. We have almost 400 people signed up for the grant program on April 26th. So please sign up for that, and it should be a wonderful program. And then on May 5th, we have a wonderful program with John Yoo. Some of you know John Yoo. I think we put our title of that program as something like Federalism, Supreme Court, blah, 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 only because we wanted to take a look at the headlines a month before. And so a month before is now, and it's going to be on Ukraine, Russia, and China with John Yoo. So please don't miss that on May 5th. And now to introduce our program is the Vice President for Legacy Foundation and Activities, Mr. Tim Gillespie. Tim.
Thank you, John. Before I introduce the speaker, two quick pieces of business. Number one, John, you have excellent taste in ties. We can say that to them. And number two, rumor has it that it is Mr. Miko's birthday today. So how about a round of applause for Mr. Miko for his birthday? Yeah. He will not be happy with me later on, by the way. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Jon Grinspan. Dr. Grinspan is the curator of political history at the Smithsonian National Museum, a native Philadelphian and a graduate of Friends Central High School. Dr. Grinspan received his bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College and master's and doctorates from the University of Virginia. He is a frequent contributor to many news outlets, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. His first book, The Virgin Vote: How Young Americans Made Democracy Social, Politics Personal, and Voting Popular in the 19th Century, was critically acclaimed and received the 2017 Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. His second book, The Age of Acrimony, is the subject of tonight's talk. It's a story of America's broken political system. I quote from John: "In the late 1800s, Americans feared that the republic was dying, torn apart by vibrant but violent partisan political campaigns. This era was only ended by a revolution in political restraint around 1900, end quote." To tell this story, The Age of Acrimony follows the saga of a Union League member, William Pig Iron Kelley, and his labor activist daughter, Florence Kelley. It has been said that studying history allows us to understand our past and in turn allows us to understand our present. In today's political climate, I think this subject, this book, and our speaker tonight will both illuminate the past and perhaps inform our future. Please join me in welcoming Jon Grinspan.
This is my first in-person talk in 2 years, so thank you all so much for coming out tonight. If I get nervous, I'm gonna pretend you're all a green dot on my laptop and that I'm in a Zoom. And also, I understand you have a very rigorous question asking policy, but I'm at the Smithsonian, I'm a federal employee, so any of you can email me and demand as much of my time as you'd like. You can ask long questions, I'll give out my email, and we really do love to hear from you, so feel free to contact. Oh, and one last thing, my parents are in the audience tonight, so please applaud. Yeah. So in my job at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, I go out to collect objects from our current politics, from elections, from conventions, from rallies, from protests, to kind of represent our moment for future generations of museum goers. That guy with the Bernie Sanders umbrella was protesting in 2016 right at City Hall, so a few blocks from here. We find people from across the political spectrum and try to collect their objects so that in 100 years, we can tell the story of American democracy to people who are to come. And I keep having the same conversation across the political spectrum. No matter what events we're at, people will say to me, something seems broken in our democracy. Something seems unprecedented. There's something kind of not normal going on in our politics. And in the other aspect of my job as a curator, I go back into our archives, our special collections, and explore the objects and artifacts, especially from the 19th century. And I keep running into ballots from stolen elections and torches from midnight rallies and uniforms from paramilitary partisan organizations. And it all kind of accumulates to evidence of a really frustrating, fractious politics in our deep past. And I've started to see that our moment in politics really is precedented. As much as it feels unprecedented, as much as we love to use the word unprecedented, many of our problems have, if not identical parallels in the past, at least tendencies in democracy that reappear over time. And those can be deeply instructive to us. That I've really come to conclude that America has survived the past crisis of democracy in our past. From the 1860s, from basically the end of the Civil War through 1900 or so, the nation experienced a generation-long culture-wide fight over politics, over how democracy should work, who should get to participate, and especially how we should behave. What are the limits on acceptable behavior in politics? This question of use and behavior seemed fundamental at the time, and it is again today. This is an era kind of like our own, which began with a lot of promise and optimism. It's really a time of huge engagement. This is the period, the second half of the 19th century, the highest turnout rates in American history. Basically, 80% of eligible voters went to the polls, as you can see from this late 19th century part of that turnout chart, between 1840 and 1900. In some states like Pennsylvania and New York and Indiana, really kind of swing states in some ways, turnout was over 90% for 5 presidential elections in a row. Really massive engagement in politics. These were also the closest elections in our history. Elections in the 1880s were decided by a few thousand voters in New York City. Kind of a whim could decide power from the presidential level. But it's all driven by really heated partisanship, by tribalism. This kind of engagement that's really good that we want from our democracy is tied up with enragement. This is the most violent period in our political history. This is the era of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, of labor unrest, of political machines that were kind of at war with each other in the streets, in the peak of political assassinations in our history. And Philadelphia was often at the center of this story. In the archives at the Smithsonian, and also in the great historical institutions we have here, like the Historical Society and the Library Company, they're objects from this period of Philadelphia's kind of role at the center of American democracy in this fraught moment. Kind of torchlit marches down Chestnut Street, or comic books like the one on the right, designed to get young Philadelphians engaged in politics in the 1860 election, to election day brawls that took place in Philadelphia. Political scientists did the math and found that in every election in Philadelphia between 1870 and 1900, there was gunfire at one polling place or another somewhere in Philadelphia. So this is a really, in some ways, it's a very different era from our own. In others, there are parallels. So there was this South Philadelphia Irish Catholic machine that did incredible jobs getting an immigrant population engaged in politics, but also sometimes leaned into unpleasant and violent measures. There was the growing African-American population in Philadelphia who struggled for engagement, for the right to vote, but also fought with what it meant to be trapped within one political party, a feeling I think many of us know today. And at the center of the story is one West Philadelphia family whose incredible influence in our democracy shows itself wherever you look. Philadelphia is in many ways a test case for this really fraught period in our politics as a historic city, as a diverse city, as the southernmost northern city of any size in America, as a center with both established wealth and real poverty and new immigrants and old traditions. Philadelphia is often a test case, a canary in the coal mine for democracy, for what it can reach to and where it falls short. And especially during this era, when attitudes towards politics kind of steadily decline across the late 19th century, when Americans said we are the worst governed country on the face of the earth, there's a famous line by Lincoln Steffens, the muckraker, that Philadelphia is the worst governed city in the country. Probably don't feel that way again today, but there are echoes. So this era is the most relevant, the most useful, and I think the most vital period in our history, but it's also among our most forgotten. And that's because it was deliberately ended by a reform period afterwards. The norms we talk about when we talk about politics are the floorboards of our own political era and the ceiling of a previous political era. There's a dramatic change around 1900 that changes how people participate, how democracy looks in people's lives. A bold new reform movement really fundamentally changes democratic behavior and manages, on the one hand, to create a calmer, more sober sense of politics. That if you look at political representations from the early 20th century, there's a lot of chin stroking, you might notice. There's a lot of sense that politics is not about fighting, is not about winning, it's not even a horse race, it's something deliberative, something individual. There's a real change in how people see their role in politics. And it also, at the same time, engagement falls away, turnout falls, so that we need to grapple with that trade-off. And this whole story from 1860 through the 1900s shows how precedented our anxieties about democracy are. And also, and this is really important, how malleable and reformable our system has been in the past, that we are not trapped on some train hurtling in some direction. People really have reformed and changed our political system in the past. And I think they can again today. And this story all starts in Philadelphia. It's hard to imagine, but in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the 1800s, there's a lot of optimism about democracy and politics in America. Now, we might not see that today. When we look back on politics in the 1800s, I think many of us immediately think of all of those who are left out of access: women, African Americans, people under 21 who cannot vote. And we're right to point out those flaws. But at the same time, if you're reading history forward, there's no bolder, more democratic experiment than America. This is a place that's really experimenting with self-government, with individuals winning the right to vote and making their voices heard in government that you're not seeing anywhere else on the planet really at that period. There's Switzerland and Australia are experimenting with it, but America is the big test case for democracy. And it's an era when voting rights expand, when working classes, people who do not own property, are participating in the elections. As this engraving from a minor camp in Pennsylvania shows, casting their ballots. Young people are playing a really significant role in politics during this period. One we've kind of forgotten. Immigrants are voting at really large numbers as soon as they can get naturalized in America, and those populations denied the right to vote. African Americans and women are building the movements that will one day win them those rights. This is the period in, say, the mid-19th century when those movements begin and kind of become serious movements on the ground that will one day change American history and voting law. And then with the end of the Civil War in 1865, with the death of slavery, and especially the defeat of the kind of aristocratic slave owners in the South, there's a revolution in how people talk about politics. The end of the slave power aristocracy introduces a more broad definition of politics, one what people called pure democracy at the time. One New Hampshire preacher in 1865 says, with the defeat of slave owners in the South, the last class government in the United States is swept away and we are left with pure democracy. There's a sense in this era, and it's not true, but there's a perception that limitations and restraints on politics are falling away, that democracy going forward after 1865 will be bolder and bigger and freer, and those old restraints are falling away. One of the best kind of encapsulations of this is this Thomas Nast cartoon on the right here, which Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner. It might be a little bit hard to see, but those are all the people from all over the world, from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, united as citizens in America. And the meal they're eating at Thanksgiving is a ballot box. The idea is that voting rights engagement will bring new freedom to America, this kind of unrestraining of those old limitations. And the voice of pure democracy is a voice unique to Philadelphia, from West Philadelphia to be specific. This is William Kelley, or as people started to call him, William Pig Iron Kelley, from West Philadelphia, although really born in Northern Liberties. He's a radical congressman who fought for abolition, for women's rights, for workers' rights, for Black voting rights. And he's one of the founding members, and I think the most popular voice in the early days of the Union League. In the winter of 1865, the Civil War is still raging. There's still enslaved people in the South. He goes into Congress in a second term and introduces a bill for Black voting rights, for African-American voting rights, and says that the United States will never be a stable democracy until it can widen its base of who participates in it. That for equality, for kind of honesty to the founders' ideals, and also for self-preservation, a bigger, bolder of definition of democracy is needed. More engagement makes democracies more stable. And he kind of captures the populist tune of the era. Now, less than a week after giving that speech, he's dining in the Willard Hotel in Washington. He's attacked by another congressman who slashes him with a knife, and he barely survives that attack, which also gives you a sense of what's going on in politics at this time. Will Kelley's really kind of a good embodiment of his era. He's one of these guys who just shows up everywhere and captures every thread. He's like a textbook of 19th century history. He was born in Northern Liberties, around 2nd Street, right where 676 becomes the Ben Franklin Bridge today. I think they paved over his original house. And he was born to a working class Philadelphia family of Scotch-Irish and Quaker roots. And his father died when he was young, when he was 2 years old. His first memory was seeing his father's tools sold on the street to raise money for his father's children. And he starts working at a really young age. He leaves school at age 11, which is roughly when people left school back then if they're going to work. He got a job, and this is really cool. He got a job at the Philadelphia Inquirer, reading the whole newspaper from front to back every day for editors. And you can't think of a better training for a young man than just reading the whole paper out loud every day. But he can't really afford to keep that job. So he starts working as an apprentice, as a jeweler, as a steel worker. And eventually he builds up this kind of working class radical identity, the sense that the working people in Philadelphia and in the nation in the 1830s are being oppressed, are being mistreated. And he really wants to launch organizations, especially for the 12-hour day, which was the big fight at the time. He eventually has to leave Philadelphia because he's kind of at odds with the conservative establishment in Philadelphia at the time, and moves to Boston. And I know no one should move to Boston, but he goes to Boston for a couple of years. Don't worry, he comes back to Philadelphia later. He starts speaking on street corners at political events, and he really stands out. He's from a young age, he's physically striking. He's 6'3". He's kind of rail thin. He has, it's hard to see, but he has a scar on one of his eyes from his life of kind of hard labor as a child. And he has a really deep, gravelly voice. He had a voice, they said, like an eloquent graveyard. And he starts giving speeches for the 12-hour day for workers' rights. And unlike a lot of activists at the time, he's speaking both for workers' rights for the white working class in Philadelphia and Boston, and for African Americans he grew up with on the streets in Philadelphia. That he's not really pitting populations at odds with each other. He gets kind of drawn into abolition, moves back to Philadelphia. He literally fights for abolition. There's a period when he carries essentially a club up his sleeve because there's so many attacks on abolitionists in Philadelphia. He enters Congress, Will Kelley does, the same year Abe Lincoln enters the White House, 1860. And he becomes an early member of the Union League in 1862 and spends the Civil War fighting to beat the Confederacy and also for African-American voting rights. This is his big cause, expand access. He ends up writing the text of the 15th Amendment that today bans discrimination based on race. He's the guy who wrote the words. He just shows up everywhere. When they dedicate the Statue of Liberty, he's there. When they unite the Transcontinental Railroad, he's there. He's just one of these figures who had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, a real Zelig. And he's an early member of the Union League, and I think he's probably the most popular voice in those early years. And he's really a good model of this pure democracy era, this idea that a big, diverse, participatory democracy will solve American problems, that more turnout, more engagement is the answer. And he starts working for the Union League. And this is a time when the meaning of union is really changing. Before the Civil War, union is often used as a kind of anti-democratic line, that the most important thing is avoiding disunion. Abolitionists are called disunionists. When mobs attack abolitionists, when mobs attack Irish Catholic immigrants, they often accuse them of threatening the union, the kind of the larger union. But with the Civil War, with the secession of the South, union suddenly becomes a pro-democracy line. And this is the period when the Union League is formed. It becomes a tool to fight for democracy, to fight for the Union, to fight for Abe Lincoln, and for emancipation and against the Confederacy. The Union League really blossoms as kind of a model of this era. You can see the tokens and rallies and that kind of thing, uniting all the people in the country who are at odds with the former slave power aristocracy. After the war, this Union League really expands from places like Philadelphia and Boston and New York into other regions, into the lower north, into the Midwest, where it becomes a partisan movement, into the South, where it forms connections with poor whites, basically, in Appalachia, and especially into freed slaves populations in the Deep South. That the Union League becomes a really unique movement that has some of the wealthiest people in the country in it, and also has hundreds of thousands of members among freed slave African Americans in Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia. It really becomes a tool for expanding this democracy to a population that is also fighting for the right to vote. It's kind of this big tent of people who feel they've won the war and want to redesign a new country. And this brings us kind of to Reconstruction. As African Americans win the right to vote in the South, Will Kelley goes south to speechify, and activists go south to form union leagues to fight for voting rights, land rights, labor reform, and self-defense, to form militias to defend African Americans from the KKK and other groups. And in 1867, when the majority of freed slaves win the right to vote, Will Kelley and a whole population of activists go south to register people. You have the kind of the original Freedom Summer in 1867. Before the summer, 0.5% of African Americans in the country are registered to vote. By the end of this one summer, 80.5% of that population are registered. They get out there with skits and magic lanterns and anything they can to reach people. Will Kelley is obviously giving speeches too, and he gets attacked for it. There's a moment when he's speaking at a podium outside in Mobile, Alabama, and KKK members in the crowd start shooting at him. And he ducks below the podium and kind of crams his 6'3" frame under the podium. But the man standing directly behind him is shot in the head and dies. And it's a riot, basically. And Will Kelley goes north. He says, I'm not going to be silenced. Free speech is the fundamental element of democracy, and holds a rally outside the Union League, 1867, and says the fundamental premise of democracy is public politics, public speech. You can't quiet me. It doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to keep talking. And in this way, he's also a really good model of the political system he lives in, which I think you can summarize in the years after the Civil War as public, partisan, and passionate. That might wrap up exactly the world we're talking about. Politics is intensely public during this era. If you want to run a campaign, you get guys, you have a rally in a town square, maybe at a school or often at a saloon. You talk to people. It's deeply social. It's about speechifying, standing on the street corner. Torchlit marches are incredibly common. They hold events like this rally in Union Square where they got in New York, where they got 20,000 torchlit marches with torches to march through the square. It's very saturating. You can't avoid it. You ride on the railroads, you take a steamboat, and people argue politics, including large numbers of people who aren't enfranchised yet. There's stories of young girls on the streetcars in St. Louis talking politics about who the mayor should be. In addition to public campaigning, there's public voting. If you want to cast a vote in the second half of the 19th century, you go to the polling place, activist for the party gives you a party printed ballot, and you cast it in front of everybody. And the ballots are color coded, so you can tell who's voting Democrat, who's voting Republican. It's seen as the most honest way to vote. You're not doing anything secretly. It's kind of about asserting your manliness and your honesty and voting in front of your community. So in addition to being public, these politics are deeply partisan. They're kind of tribal in a way that might be familiar to us. People pick their parties based not so much on the ideology, but based on their race, their class, their ethnicity, what church or synagogue they belong to, what occupation they have. Back then, they could really tell most of who would vote how based on the clothes they wear. Did they have an Irish accent? Did they have a German accent? Did they have a Yankee accent or a Southern accent? It's really kind of tied in with ethnicity and identity. And party kind of assumes a lot of other identities. There's a famous story about an immigrant being naturalized in Pennsylvania, in Altoona, in the late 19th century. And he's asked, can you explain the system of the American government to me? Kind of part of the civics test you get when you're naturalized as a citizen. And he says, it's two-sided. There's Democrats and there's Republicans. They expected the three branches of government, something more civics-based, but if you live on the ground in 19th century America, it feels like these are the two clubs and they're at war with each other. It feels two-sided to people. And you can understand why people would participate in a political system this way. We're talking about an era of mass immigration when many people who are voting were born in Ireland or Germany or Russia or Italy or in a small town in Wisconsin or central Pennsylvania and have moved to a city, have given up their old traditions, their old kind of cultures, and are working in a factory, living in a tenement, and they're cut loose from their old bonds and they need something new. And the parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, are there. They want their votes. They want their participation. They want them to drink at the Democratic saloon or the Republican saloon. It really, in a disrupted nation at a disrupted time, it feels like membership to people, and it's incredibly appealing. So this system is public, it's partisan, and it's deeply passionate. It is not often about the issues. Prominent politicians say, I never argue the issues with voters on the street. I don't try to convince them to feel a certain way about the tariff. I try to convince them to hate the other side, or at the very least to come to our rally, to drink some beer and to wave a torch. You know, there's a sense that it's not really driven by, for most people, ideological engagement and really strict lines. And the press furthers that. They run basically what's called government by indignation at the time. That kind of heated, angry, sarcastic press will really push this sense of two-sided politics, two sides at war with each other. And this drives up engagement, but it also means some pretty ugly behavior. And you do see this in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a number of machines that really help bring populations who are isolated into politics, but also sometimes brings out the worst elements of that. A good example is the Irish Catholic machine in South Philadelphia, run by Squire William McMullen, called the Squire, who grew up in Southwark, in South Philly. It survived riots and attacks on the Irish Catholic community there in 1844, fought to defend his community, and then worked to bring people into the political system, bringing outsiders in as aldermen, as candidates, but also at the same time used the network for kind of violent ends sometimes to swing elections. Philadelphia takes the lead in voter fraud in this era in the North. Are you sure? People say bad things happen in Philadelphia. I don't know if that's true. Yeah, so one of the things they said that I kind of like this joke is that in any election in the late 19th century, you could find Ben Franklin's name on the poll list, that somebody wrote in his name every time. They said Philadelphia was a city where the founders voted once, and when they vote again, basically you still find Ben Franklin, George Washington, somebody wrote that in, some wise guy, when they voted illegally. And they practiced something called colonizing, which is when you move people to a new state, get them residency for a couple weeks, however long it takes, and then use them to swing a close election. And as I said, these are the closest elections in our history. So a few thousand voters can make a difference. You put them up in tenements, you feed them beer all day, and they swing the election. And because Philadelphia is right at the center of that whole string of East Coast cities, they can go up to New York or down to DC or show up in Newark. They can go out. They often went out to Harrisburg to kind of intimidate the rural elements of the Democratic Party to vote the way they wanted, or that kind of thing. So these are the dirty tricks they used at the time. This print on the right is actually of New Yorkers coming to swing an election in West Philadelphia. And you can see knocking some people down in the process. So you have different aspects of a political machine. You have the people who hand out ballots, the people who speechify, and what they called shoulder hitters at the time. You have lung workers and shoulder hitters. Lung workers make arguments, shoulder hitters knock the other guys down, essentially. They're the reason there's gunfire at all these elections. And that's a key element. You also have a African-American population in Philadelphia that's really growing and really crucial and is finding its ways into politics. For a while, Will Kelley's house in West Philadelphia, he had a mansion called the Elms at what's now 41st and Parish, is kind of the nerve center of that whole community. But as African-Americans win the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, which he wrote, they build up their own local networks. Many of you may know about Octavius Catto, the voting rights activist, principal, and ball player who was famously tragically assassinated in 1871 on South Street. There's a marker there, I believe 7th and South, where one of McMullen's guys shoots him down. But there are others. There's a guy named Isaiah Weirs who lives in Northern Liberties, where kind of middle-class African Americans live. And he's a barber and a realtor. And as a barber and a realtor, you meet a lot of people. And anyone who has a lot of connections, knows a lot of people, can swing a lot of votes. So he builds kind of a middle-class African American machine in Northern Liberties. And then in South Philly, there's a guy named Gil Ball who runs a saloon right next to the Democratic Machine Saloon of Squire McMullen. And Gil Ball runs kind of an on-the-ground African-American political machine. He's often at war with the Democratic activists from Squire McMullen's saloon. But at the end of the day, the two of them, Gil Ball and Squire McMullen, would drink with each other after elections and compare notes. How did you get your guys out to vote? How did you convince people? And they kind of built this larger political culture. But there's this growing sense among African-American voters in Philadelphia that they're trapped in a partisan system. Essentially, very few African-Americans would vote for the Democratic Party at the time. It's openly hostile in most of America and calls itself the party of white supremacy. But if you're stuck in one party, if you're stuck in the Republican Party, it starts to take you for granted. There's a reverend from Georgia came up and gave a speech to African-Americans in Philadelphia saying, with all your speaking, organizing, parading, ballyhooing, holding mass meetings, voting, and fighting in the streets, what do you get? And that's the fundamental question of this era. You have mass participation, you have mass turnout. People are really putting a lot of labor into politics. What are they getting for it? What reform, what policies is changing things on the books? And Philadelphia kind of comes to symbolize that huge engagement, but kind of lack of follow through. There's a reformer, Lincoln Steffens, who's a famous muckraker. He wrote Shame of the Cities, and he warned other cities about going down what he called the road to Philadelphia and despair, following this model. But Steffens makes a really important point about Philadelphia too. There's a tendency to kind of blame minorities for what's going on in politics in America, the Irish Catholic machines or African Americans. But he points out that the dominant The top of the machine in Philadelphia is native-born white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Philadelphia is kind of known for that. And it's just as crooked as any other element of the machine. There's something systemic in democracy in 19th century America that's bringing out this crooked behavior. It's not about this population or that population. It's about the way the system is used. That public, partisan, passionate politics is bringing out kind of the worst in a lot of people. And there's a sense in the 1870s, 1880s that pure democracy is curdling, that what's happening on the ground in terms of people's behavior is not living up to what the new laws of the country are and this new hope. Frederick Douglass writes a letter to his friend Will Kelley after the passage of the 15th Amendment saying, the country is ruled by sentiment as well as law. And the best laws on the statutes on the books are the merest mockery in the hands of men who hate them. That it doesn't really matter what the laws are to some degree if you can't go vote or if you're intimidated from participating. And kind of the worst model of this is the 1876 election, which some of you may have heard of. This is the centennial election, 100 years since the Declaration of Independence. It's 15 years since the Civil War. It's seen as kind of the moment, the referendum on the last 15 years of American life. And it's a huge election. It has the highest turnout of any election in American history up to today. 82% of eligible voters go to the polls. And those denied the right to vote are still arguing the issues, reading the papers. They get massive engagement. People turn out, they vote, they drink a beer, they go home, and no one knows who won. The popular vote is clearly won by the Democratic candidate, but 4 key states' electoral votes, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, are up in the air. And both parties scramble down to Florida again and down to Louisiana, essentially to steal the election from the other side. The Democrats steal it on the ground, the Republicans steal it on the recount. And what happens after 6 months of really ugly squabbling is that the loser of the popular vote, the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, becomes president. He lost by 250,000 votes, which in the nation at that time is really a lot. He gets to become president for the next 4 years. And so 1876 was supposed to be the centennial moment. They have this huge centennial exhibition in Philadelphia, which Will Kelley organized, by the way. And yet, when you have an election, you can get people to vote, you can get them to participate, they feel like they're citizens, and then you don't even know who won the election for 6 months after that. And you can really see the arc of attitudes towards democracy turning at this point. If people are pretty confident out of the Civil War, 1876 is this really hard turn towards pessimism, towards hostility. A lot of people blame politicians as a class. There are lots of nasty cartoons comparing the politicians of the late 19th century to what the founding fathers looked like and finding them really wanting. And sometimes playing into ethnic bigotries and negative depictions of Irish immigrants and that kind of thing. Elite critics, like the famous historian Francis Parkman, say democracy doesn't work. We've proved it. He says democracy, kind of in a snide way, is a scam to steal power from superior to inferior men. That hordes of native and foreign barbarians armed with a ballot are perverting democracy. That equality and majority rule just don't work. And in this era, this is the era when in the South, you see real attacks on Reconstruction and on Black voting rights. The Union League, its wing in the South, is violently suppressed by the KKK. 1/5 of leaders of the Union League in Alabama and Mississippi are murdered or assaulted during this era. One congressman estimates that 53,000 African Americans are murdered during these fights over Reconstruction and redemption. That's the scale of a large war, and yet it happens during this political system. Now, in the rest of the country, the problem isn't that voting is ending, it's that it's overheating. Each election seems to draw more turnout, closer elections. Even after the issues of Reconstruction are over, in the 1880s, you get closer and closer elections, more and more heated turnouts. There's something kind of about that unrestrained pure democracy that is bringing out the worst in people, it seems. And it really bottoms out, people would say, in the late 1880s. There's a great account from Rudyard Kipling, the famous writer, Englishman living in India, taking a boat from Japan to San Francisco. And the boat is full of Americans. And he kind of says, all right, I'm going to have to hear the Americans brag about America the whole ride. And he starts talking politics with them. And people say things like, no one but a low-down man will run for Congress. The more power you give people, the more trouble they'll give you. One sailor says he's been around the world 3 times and he's never met people who can govern themselves. They basically take him aside as an Englishman and say, don't set up democracy, full democracy and voting rights in England because we don't think it works in America. it's a really dark period. We don't really have much memory of how much hostility there was towards the political system in the Gilded Age because we've willfully forgotten it. Now, in these years, in 1890, Will Kelley dies. He has a funeral at the Unitarian Church at Chestnut and 22nd, I think, and he's buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery. And a number of politicians come up from DC, his friends, and they basically say, there goes the last honest man. There goes the last statesman rather than politician. And his death at 1890 seems like the marking of an end of an era to a lot of people. But it's also the moment when reform is kind of built up. In around 1890, 1887 or so, reformers from left and from right who don't really agree on the direction America should go can agree that the current political system just isn't working. That what they need to do, they think, is restrain that public, partisan, passionate style of politics. The famous muckraking journalist Henry Damaris Lloyd says, government by party is not a means of settling things. It's the best of devices for keeping them unsettled. And I think we can see some honesty in that. There's a sense that the best thing they can do is not have one side beat the other, but calm down the whole political system. Make politics more respectable, more civil, more restrained is the word they use a lot. Don't change law, change behavior. James Russell Lowell, who's a famous humorist from this era, gives a speech in 1888 where he says basically, this is worse than the Civil War. During the Civil War, we risked losing half the country, meaning the South, but now we risk losing our whole country. The political system is systemically broken, and the way we can save it is by digging into what he calls, and I kind of love this line, the drainage and ventilation of politics. It's about systems, it's about machines, it's not so much about condemning the evildoers in society, which preachers and reformers had done forever and gotten no results. It's about figuring what are the mechanisms that drive behavior and how can you change them. So they start digging into campaigning and they do things like those big rallies, those torchlit rallies. A lot of cities say you need a permit to rally now and you need to have a good reason and we can pull your permit. It hasn't always been the way that you need a permit and a good reason to hold a rally and the city can take it away. That's an effort to shut down those rallies and also to shut down labor activism. A lot of activists work to close saloons on election day. And more broadly, saloons are really a key headquarters for kind of working class politics. And a lot of these more elite activists see saloons and drinking as part of the problem. So they close saloons on election day. A lot of people work to replace those volunteers who are buying you a beer at the saloon with paid staff, with bureaucrats who run campaigns from fancy offices. This is an incredible photograph from the 1896 campaign of African-American politicians and campaigners in one of those offices. And their job isn't to go out and bend an ear and treat people and buy them a brandy and argue with them about politics. Their job is to print pamphlets and material and argue the issues. And they also start to reform voting. They really make it so that you don't vote in public anymore. They introduce the secret ballot printed by the government, not handed to you by some party activist or forced on you, a kind of sober, cold ballot where you often vote in private. And that's in some ways a lot better. You know, there isn't this ugliness, there isn't this violence. It's run by the government, not the parties on election day. And they talk about a voter alone with his conscience, really not as a member of society, as a member of certain, religious groups and identities, but as an individual making up his mind. They build this larger shift. And a lot of their new voting machines have voting curtains. You vote in total isolation with the idea that your boss, the neighborhood block captain, whoever can't tell you how to vote. And that's really beneficial, but it really does change how you engage in politics, how you connect to your community. There's a sense that before, politics was about community, something social, turning out, arguing, yelling, singing songs, yelling slogans and voting. It's really private going forward. It's a new conception of how democracy should work in our lives. And a lot of these reformers have mixed motives. Some of them are really working to clean up politics, to make them more rational, less violent. Many of them are also women's suffrage activists and are kind of pushing that needed reform as well. But there's some who are working with what they call the secret cause, which is to turn down turnout, to make voting less appealing, less accessible, less popular, to really get fewer citizens, especially fewer working class citizens, to go to the polls. You can call this the Great Quieting. Around 1900, you can see what happens to turnout. That high bar of turnout is the 19th century, and that crash is 1900. 80% of eligible voters go to the polls in elections for 1840 to 1900. And then it crashes in election after election until by 1924, fewer than half of voters are going to participate. A third of eligible voters stop voting. Even the expansion of the right to vote to women does not change that cultural falling away of engagement in politics. And also who's voting changes. It's not across the board. Working class people, less educated people used to vote at higher rates than wealthier people in America. Well, that switches around this era, and people who are wealthier and more educated turn out at much higher rates. And today, the biggest distinction in who turns out to vote is education and class. That's kind of an artifact of this era. Young people vote less. Immigrants are voting less. Children of immigrants are voting less. African Americans are voting less in the North as well as in the South. Now, some people are outright banned from voting. In southern states, it becomes illegal or life-threatening to try to vote if you're African American. In Louisiana, there are 130,000 African American voters in the 1890s. By 1900, there are 1,300. It becomes life-threatening to try to participate in politics. For a larger majority of voters in cities like Philadelphia, it's simply discouraged. It's harder. It's less appealing. You want to turn out less. And people want to participate less. There are all these other things in the new world to participate in. Instead of drinking at a saloon with your party club, you can watch baseball or football or enjoy Hollywood or read tabloids. They're new kind of forms of membership and community, which was so wanting in the 19th century. For kids, there's Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, there are bowling leagues, Kiwanis Club, all these forms of membership. And there are new ways to make your voice heard. There are boycotts, there are consumer activist organizations, there's lobbying. There are all these ways kind of around the big old fight of general elections. And there's structural changes as well. In 1911, during this era, these reformers stopped the expansion of the seats in Congress relative to the population. For all of American history up till 1911, Congress expanded as the population expanded. And there was a real sense that you could meet your congressman. They freeze that at 435 congresspeople in 1911, and we still have 435 congresspeople today, even though we have a population that's 3 times larger. That's going to change how you interact with politics, how often you meet your representatives. A lot of people, kind of administrators and bureaucrats, start to run the federal government and state governments, as opposed to the ward heeler or the boss down at the saloon who does you a favor. There's now a system for how politics is run, and it's often behind the scenes. That muckraker I quoted before, Henry Damaris Lloyd, said, in the 19th century, we had politics without government. In the 20th century, we were moving to government without politics. There's a sense of kind of a withdrawing of political engagement from the public sphere. But there are also really beneficial changes going on. Partisanship falls. It becomes admired to be an independent in the early 20th century. The person who strokes his chin and makes up his mind in the voting booth, that's who you want to be. You don't want to be the guy following the sheep to vote the same way. That's really seen as admirable until by the middle of the 20th century, political scientists start worrying that there's not enough partisanship in America. People can't tell Republicans from Democrats in the 1960 election, say, and violence falls. This is really important. In the late 19th century, a congressman is murdered once every 7 years by somebody who doesn't like him. In the 20th century, there are 3 murders of congressmen over the whole of the century, and we probably know them all: RFK and Huey Long and Leo Ryan. There's a real change in how people engage violently in politics. There's all right, that was a cliffhanger. Now you find out what happens. It's pretty often in the 19th century that people would challenge editors of newspapers to duels violently. There are plenty of editors who get murdered for publishing the wrong story about the wrong guy. That really falls away in the 20th century. So you have this political system that's cleaner, that's safer, that's a little bit more engageable. It all amounts to this big change in politics. This public, partisan, passionate system becomes private, becomes independent, and becomes restrained. This is the era when it becomes kind of impolite to talk politics at the dinner table. In 19th century America, that's all everyone ever did, was talk politics and steamboats and saloons and the dinner table. In the 20th century, you don't tell people how you're going to vote as often. There's this real change in politics, and you can see how our old model of 20th century normal politics emerges from this era. Even the kind of the key symbols and icons of politics change. In 19th century politics, as I said, when you want to run an election, you get a bunch of guys, you give them torches and uniforms and have them march down Broad Street or Chestnut Street. In Philadelphia, again, in 1900, there's a Republican convention. It's sweltering July days, and people start wearing straw boaters and seersucker linen suits. That becomes the model, almost the icon for a person in politics for much of the 20th century. If you think of political events, if you think of political cartoons, they often have a straw boater on their head to keep cool. It becomes a symbol of especially conventions. Now you have to see the difference between guys in uniforms with torches and guys in linen and straw boaters. It sends a different motto. It sends a different symbol of kind of restraint in politics. And over the last 100 years, the Smithsonian's collections really reflect this. We have boater hats. We have Wisconsin Green Bay Packer cheese heads that are boater style. Plenty of cheese heads. We have elephant trinkets and donkey trinkets. We have confetti from every convention for the last 40 years. We saved the confetti. But over the last decade, we've come to feel that our collection doesn't reflect the mood of contemporary politics as much. So we've been working to tell the story of 20th century democracy, which is much more combative. And we often come back to Philadelphia. We collected, you may have seen the dancing mailbox costumes from the kind of count every vote moment right after the 2020 election. There's one in the Smithsonian now. When New Jersey Representative Andy Kim cleaned up the Capitol after January 6th, this was in the news, I'm sure you saw it, he donated his suit also to the Smithsonian. So we're working often through Philadelphia to kind of represent our moment in time. As upsetting as it may be, it's our job to reflect it for future generations. And as we go out to these events, talk politics with people, I keep feeling that there are a few lessons, a few takeaways from this kind of forgotten deep history of not normal politics. The first is that this is not the first time we've worried about our democracy as a country. This is not the end of the world. This is not unprecedented. We have a really deep and robust history of anxiety, anger, frustration with our political system. We haven't driven off a cliff. The second point I think these people show us is that reform really is possible. In the late 19th century, a reform movement identified problems with their political system and deliberately changed them. Not all ugly eras end in civil war. This is an era where, while there were trade-offs, good and bad, this is an era when reformers really made change in their political system. The third is, as I said, there were trade-offs, that the ability to calm down our political system also discouraged participation. And as we think about how to calm our democracy yet again today, we'll probably engineer new trade-offs. That's just the nature of history. The fourth and final point I'd like to make is that the culture of politics is the key to all of this. You may have noticed I haven't said that much about Supreme Court justices or presidents in this talk. Much more interested in how campaigning works on the ground, how activists, how party people reach out to voters. There's really a sense in looking at this 19th century politics that the thing that matters is not presidents from this era who are pretty mediocre in the most part. It's how the guy at the corner saloon talks to you about politics, or it's how the schoolgirls on the streetcar argue about the next mayor's race. There's a famous quote from Lincoln Steffens, this muckraker, who said, it's a really strong quote. I don't 100% agree with it, but it's really powerful. He says, the misgovernment of the American people is the misgovernment by the American people. And by that, he means it's not conspiracies, it's not cabals, it's how we all relate to our political system that determines how it looks on the ground. We shape the behavior of our own political system. And this is a story that I think it's more intimate and more human than amendments and presidents and cabinet members. And it's one we can tell through South Philly saloons and Northern Liberty barbershops and torchlit rallies down Chestnut Street and Philadelphia convention halls. And I think the basic lesson of this whole story is that our democracy is more versatile, more malleable, and more reformable, and less normal than we give it credit. And I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts on this story.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. Questions for Dr. Grinspan? Yes, Chris.
Question on the Great Quieting, I think it was, that the participation really crashed. And did that have anything to do with the influenza?
That is a great question. The influenza comes pretty late in the crash. Is this working? This is working now. The influenza comes fairly late in the crash. That turnout crashes from 1896. It starts this fall, and influenza doesn't come along till 1918. But influenza does lead to this new culture of kind of less kind of big public engagement. That if you look at how, in general, not just in politics, 19th century Americans engage with each other, there's a lot of rubbing shoulders. There's a lot of mixing, and influenza scares people. People interact less. They turn out less. The idea that you can go vote and run away really quickly becomes popular. They also blame cars for this. They say when people lived in small communities and you had to walk for a day to go vote on Tuesday, it was like a market day. You bought things, you talked to your neighbors. When cars come into things in the early 20th century, you drive to vote and you drive away again. So influenza, I think it has some effect, but it's part of this whole kind of balling of a cultural change that just changes how people interact with politics.
Jim, question back there.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm comforted and I have hope. Would you care to comment on one thing that, as I reflect on this period and the present period, and that is the information age that we live in? One of the huge differences, it seems to me, as we look at our current situation and 100 years ago, is the ability to transmit information, whether true or false, to millions of people instantly. Would you care to comment on how you see that and the effect of that compared to the acrimonious period that you've pointed to in your presentation?
Yeah, great question. And one I think about a lot. I think there are two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, we live in a fundamentally different era than any era before us. We have precedents, but we don't have repeats. And so the effect of social media, mass media, disinformation on our politics, I think is obvious to us all and has been really harmful. And you can see that on the ground, and you can see that in how we treat each other. So on the one hand, you could say, no, this is different. They're not carrying around phones. They're not reading Facebook 10 times a day. But if you look at how it felt to Americans in the 19th century to build this huge newspaper network, America has more newspapers than any other nation on earth at that time. You get the telegraph introduced in the 1840s, which means what used to be distance, and distance was time back then, what used to really keep cities separate, regions separate, is suddenly part of one big conversation with the rise of the telegraph and accessible newspapers. And you can argue with people who live really far away from you. And the newspapers, to sell newspapers, kind of gin up the sense of kind of national fight being fought out. That Henry David Thoreau famously said, they're connecting Maine and Texas by telegraph, but what do they even have to talk about? Well, one of the things they have to talk about is politics, right? We have a shared federal system. And so we might have really big differences on the ground, but one thing we have to bring us all together is we're fighting over politics. Newspapers operate really in bad faith in this era. Almost every paper is a partisan paper. Many print constant streams of disinformation. The belief among many people who supported secession in 1860 that Abe Lincoln was an abolitionist was entirely false. It was a lie they'd been told about this guy they would never met and live far away. So we don't see the same thing we're seeing today with social media, but we do see how bad actors who want to basically make a buck and gain notoriety can gin up a really hostile system when they're having people talk with each other without any kind of arbiter. And in the 20th century, what happens is there are fewer newspapers. They condense and consolidate. And that's how you get things like the Herald Tribune. In 19th century America, the New York Herald and the New York Tribune are at war with each other. As they condense in the 20th century, you have a bottleneck where people have more control over the news. There are more editors and gatekeepers, and there's a shared conversation. I think in many ways, our conversation today looks more like people who read 10 small town newspapers and argue over the really partisan issues in the 19th century. So it's different, but there are echoes, I guess, would be the best answer I can give.
Any other questions? John, thank you so much. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. Thank you. We hope you'll be back with us on the 26th of April for our program on U.S. Grant, and then on the 5th with John Yu on Ukraine, Russia, and China. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. And again, John, thank you. Where are your parents? right there. I told them with the Yamaha.
No.
Imagine the